Other than a few people in the crowd, we're probably all right about in those years, aren't we? Some of you have celebrated golden anniversaries, I would imagine. One of the hard things about this lesson for me was trying to think of the why. Why did God have this where it's at? As we go through this lesson, try to think how these lessons, this part of the history fits in with God's redemptive plan. We don't often think of that when we're on top of the world. Everything's going good. Everything's going our way. It's God. Wrong. And I think maybe that that God showed us this very early in Israel's history. Not early on. You got to think that it's been now 500 years since they've come into the land. Almost 500 years since they've come into the land. And sometimes that's hard to fathom because we've only gone through Joshua and Judges. It only took us 20 minutes to read, or 45 minutes to read 500 years of history. And so the United States has been in existence, what, maybe 240, 250 years, something like that. So not even half that long. And think of all of the history that we have so far. Oh, how about some remote control stuff? So just a little bit of history lesson to bring us up to. Oh, and I want to give you this. This is a free lesson. This part of this is a free lesson. If you're ever going to hang drywall on the ceiling, go to the rental place and get a tool to do that with, a lift or something. I think maybe only the third argument that we ever had last night, and neither of us know what it was about, but we were both so tired after hanging 5 sheets of drywall on the ceiling that we just snapped at each other. And I don't even know what it was about. So that's just freebie today. Yeah, one of the nice things about getting old, I forget what it was about. Okay, little history. This is a picture, this is a map of Israel when we get to the end of this lesson, at what Israel will look like at the end. Now, they just kind of come into the middle part of this, but this period of history is around that 1000 BC era. Just depends on what scholar you're reading under. You know, they've got David anywhere from 1077 to 1010 for his reign starting, and Solomon anywhere from 1038 to 970. So it's kind of hard to put a date on something, but it's in that 1000 era. Okay, and now David has already been anointed by Samuel to replace Saul, whom you remember God rejected because he disobeyed him, because he didn't listen to Samuel and he started sacrificing before, and then he saved the king Agag and all of that. 1 Samuel 16:13 is when David was anointed. And now David's gone through all of these difficult years of Saul chasing him, trying to kill him, trying to put a spear through him, and even the chance that David had to kill Saul and didn't. So he's gone through all of those difficult years. And 2 Samuel chapter 1 begins with David hiding I gotta do this. Hiding in a place called Ziklag, which is down here near the Negev desert. David had been hiding out in Philistia with the Philistines, and the Philistines have been fighting with Saul. So David's kind of safe down here because Saul's not coming down after him. So he's got quite an entourage. I guess there's about 600 to 1,000 people with him. But he's down here in this place called Ziklag. And Samuel has died already, some years previous to this. And Saul and Jonathan go up to Mount Gilboa, which is right about there, to fight with the Philistines. And both of them get the same day on Mount Gilboa. And this Amalekite youth comes to David, comes all the way down to Ziklag to David to bring him that news that Saul and Jonathan are dead. And David writes a very lengthy lamentation about over Saul and Jonathan's death and mourns for them at Ziklag. And that's where when the first time we hear that phrase, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." And he repeats that in that lamentation. 1 Samuel 1:27. David inquires of the Lord, and the Lord tells him to go to Hebron. Hebron is right near Jerusalem, Bethlehem. David was from Bethlehem. Hebron is just a little bit south of that, and it's over here in the expanded section. That's why I tried to make it a little bit bigger for you to be able to see about the geographical area that we're dealing with. And he tells David to go to Hebron, and there the elders of Judah make David their king. Abner, the son of Ner, takes Saul's son. Abner was Saul's commander-in-chief, or commander of his army. He takes Saul's son Ishbosheth and goes to a place called Menahem, which is on the other side in what they call the Transjordan, where the two of the tribes had stayed on that side of the Jordan. You remember when Moses had brought everybody up to the river. And these two sides are going to fight for years. And eventually, David's house will overpower Saul's house, and the elders of Israel will come to Hebron to meet with David and to make him king over Israel. At Jerusalem. David has taken kicked the Jebusites out of Jerusalem and taken over Jerusalem to Jerusalem to make him the king over all of the nation. And the golden years that we're going to cover, it's going to start in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and it's going to go all the way through 2 Kings chapter 11. Now, Samuel's dead, so who wrote 2 Samuel? Anybody know? Even most of 1 Samuel. Nobody knows for certain who wrote it. It was originally one book. Nobody knows who wrote it or when it was written. It's a lot of history, and it includes Samuel and things that followed after Samuel. I guess that's why they named it Samuel, but Samuel didn't write this.
So some think it was Nathan the prophet.
Nathan the prophet probably would be a good guess.
Or even perhaps David or Solomon.
Wow, even that far up. Could have been. And the years that we're going to cover is going to be from his hiding at Ziklag anointed king over Judah at Hebron, fights 3 years with the house of Saul until he finally gets stronger than them. Ishbosheth's commander, Abner, attempts to make the transfer of the kingdom to David, but David's commander, Joab, murders him. And all of that intrigue and things that we see leading up to this, you kind of got to wonder why it's called the golden years, because there is so much politics and killing and house cleaning that goes on in here that it really gives us an insight to how people deal with power, how power, I won't say corrupts, but how it affects what people do to each other.
Ron, there's something interesting because Joab hated Abner, mainly because Abner killed his brother.
Abner killed his brother.
But the thing
Didn't
is,
want to.
Joab seemed to always have a fear that David would replace him as commander to his army. And I think that's part of the reason he killed Abner, because Abner had gone and made peace with David and to give him the other tribes. The interesting part is, those tribes of Israel weren't necessarily ready to follow David until they saw how David mourned for Abner's death.
Yeah, and you see that as you read through this story, how fair David treated his. He didn't consider them his enemies. He considered them his brothers and tried to always figure out a reason why they just couldn't get along and trying to make things right and fair with them. David became greater and greater because the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him, it says in 2 Samuel 5:10, which automatically makes you think this. Romans 8:31, what does it say? What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? So the lesson that we learn from David's success was because he obeyed God. And he inquired of God before he did things. And then when God told him what to do, he did those things that God told him to do. Therefore, God was for David, and he was successful at what he did. It wasn't perfect. They forgot some of the things that they were supposed to do. David wanted to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Went down there to the house of Abinadab, where this thing had been held in his house on the hill for a while, made a brand new cart for it, oxen, Levites there to lead the thing back and put the ark on the cart, and started hauling it to Jerusalem. What was wrong with that?
They were supposed to do that, supposed to carry the poles, certain Levites.
God had told them how that thing was supposed to be transported on the poles by the Levites on foot. And they didn't do it that way. And
Whose way did they do it?
what's that?
Whose way did they do it? They do it. Where'd they get the idea to put it on that cart?
Philistines?
The Philistines. That's what the Philistines had done to get rid of it. They put it on a cart.
And send it on a cart up there. Okay, yeah. So they made a new cart. But nobody, it's odd that nobody took the time. This is an instruction book, y'all.
But Ron, what do people do today?
Exactly.
See, they saw the way they did it, and they said, well, that must be okay.
If you're gonna do something, and this is one of the lessons that I learned out of this. If you're gonna do something, and it seems like it's a pretty important thing that you're gonna do, check here first.
That's a lesson we should learn from that.
Check here first.
God
This is-
spoken before.
You know what, an acronym for Bible that I've always loved. Basic instructions before leaving Earth.
Amen.
And it's relative just as much today as it was then. And if they had, every time we see them getting in trouble is because they've done something that God told them not to do, or they've not done something that God told them to do. And we see the same thing. I guess Uzzah was a Levite. It doesn't say, I don't recall if it says what tribe Uzzah was from, but he had every good intention. The ark was going to fall off of the cart, and he reached up to touch it, to hold it, to steady it. And God killed him right there. And then David was like, now how am I going to do this? If this is what happened, how am I going to do this? So they put it in this other guy's house. And for the months that it was there, this guy was blessed amazingly, to where everybody was saying so-and-so is being blessed because the ark is there. And so David must have gone back, or somebody went back and read, how do we transport this thing? And so when they brought it into Jerusalem the second time, or the first time, when they transported it the second time, they did it the right way, and everything went well. And so then after the Lord had given David rest from all of his surrounding enemies, David wants to build a house for the ark of God. But God tells David through Nathan the prophet that he, God, would raise up a son from David's body and establish his kingdom, and that he would build a house for God's name. And that kingdom would be established forever. Now think about this when we go to study in prophecy. Man doesn't have the power to understand how prophecy will be fulfilled before it's fulfilled, before it happens. We couldn't have read this and known at that time that God was talking about Jesus building the church, and that kingdom would be forever. We're so short-sighted that all that we really think about was, okay, one of my sons is going to build this house. And so we can only see that when we look back at what God has said and then what is being done, and then we can see the real picture. So we can't be too hard on them on how they missed this interpretation. But at the same time, God had told them, if a prophet tells you something and it doesn't come true, then don't listen to that prophet.
It goes to show the difference between how God thinks and the way man thinks.
We learn that too, that there is a difference in the way that this all is being thought of.
You mentioned we don't know until it happens or God says, but there are occasions where he says, this is the fulfillment of that promise.
When we hear, this is to fulfill what they said, exactly.
There are those today, in and out, other religious groups that say, okay, this fulfills that, but they don't know, we don't know, and especially within the destruction of Jerusalem, that was, the Old Testament and Revelation, as well as people take that and say, we know this is what it means from God.
One of my teachers early on said he has studied the last 10 chapters of Ezekiel for almost 40 years and never have figured out what it meant. Building the temple and all of that.
I think, we have everything here that we can look at and compare. But you have people today, even though we have the Bible in its entirety, right, that still don't see it or see all of it for truth. Whereas back then, you had those people that had prophets, some of them walked with Christ, they had we might not have today, and we have things that they didn't, but back then, just like today, you had people that believed, truth, and some that didn't. Today, we have everything we need here. You have some people who believe today, and some who don't.
That's some, and she's right, because if you think about it, when you look at even the life of Christ or the time of Christ, you had people that believed the scriptures and saw that fulfillment, but denied the fulfillment because they didn't want to believe the fulfillment.
Yeah.
When you sit there and you think about those high priests, when those soldiers come to them and tell them exactly everything they saw, the rolling away of the stone, the earthquake, the angels talking to the women, and he telling them that he had resurrected, what they say? Here's some money.
Yeah.
Here's what you go say. They had made up their mind, no matter what happened, they were never going to accept him as the Messiah. And you have people that way too. No matter what you show in the scriptures, I'm not going to believe that, no matter what I did. And getting back to that point, though, on this prophecy, that's a twofold prophecy. It has two pieces of fulfillment.
Mhm.
And sometimes we don't want to see that.
Yeah, and a lot of those things that we don't take the whole scripture into consideration. Not only the mountain in front of us that God is talking about, but all of the little peaks that we can only see just the tops or a piece of off in the future, and try to draw a picture of the whole mountain from that little piece of a picture, or just ignoring the picture altogether. Also, looking back, as Lot's wife could testify, is not always good. So you have to keep it in perspective. You say, okay, this was fulfilled, that means there's no other fulfillment coming. Or not waiting for something, not waiting for taking the time to wait on the Lord. God told Abraham he was going to give him a son. He didn't get a son right away, so he went about things his own way. And we see the mess that left behind. So there's both perspectives. You have to try to keep everything in perspective, and at the same time realize we're not God. So we need to rely on him a whole lot more to fulfill the things that he said in his time.
You mentioned Ezekiel. That's true. I've studied it, and there are those that think, well, God's going to have another temple another physical temple. And it's pretty clear to me that it's apocalyptic or, symbols and so on. And Herod built another temple that was 3, but it sounds like that temple was spiritual one that Ezekiel's talking about.
Well, and the Hebrews talks about shadows and copies, and God told Moses, build this according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. So he got it from somewhere. It exists somewhere. Maybe it exists in heaven. Maybe it exists in the mind of God anyway. And so, there's still things that we don't know. And even with all of the success that David has had, he's still subject to temptation. He's still subject to sin and temptation like any man. But this is how David talked. And if you go back and you read through the 2 Samuel and 1 Kings and compare how David talked to what it says about Solomon, the Lord loved Solomon. Solomon loved the Lord. the dedication prayer that he made was amazing at that. But this is how David talked to God, about God. And everything was, all of the glory was always given to God. Very humble. Because of your promise and according to your own heart, you have brought about all of this greatness to make your servant know it. So David understands that he's just the recipient of all of this grace. He's not the reason that God is doing it. God is doing it to make his name great, not because David's such a great guy. And we see that talked about throughout Israel's history. And he talks about, you are great, Lord God, for there's none like you, and there's no God beside you, according to all that we have heard with our ears. And that's because he was reading from there. But then we see kind of a downfall starting here. In the spring of the year, when it's time for the kings to go out to battle. It's interesting how this starts. They have a battle season. We got football season, or baseball, I guess, starts in the spring. But they just went out and fight with each other in the spring. David remained in Jerusalem. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time can be disastrous for your faith. From that time forward, God had warned Cain. Sin is always crouching at the door, but you have to rule over it. It was a learning lesson for Cain. He explained things to Cain, how this worked. And that's what's happened. This is what happened to David. Wrong place, wrong time. Sees Bathsheba on the roof, taking a bath. Sends his men down there. Goes through that whole scenario thing with Uriah the Hittite. And then God sends Nathan the prophet to David, and he tells him this story about the man with the sheep. We all remember that, the little ewe lamb that the guy had, and how the other rich guy killed it, and David got really mad, and Nathan said, "You're the man." Rather than killing the prophet, rather than killing the messenger, David listened to the message and repented. He said that he had sinned, but there's consequences to all of this. And from this point on, we see a lot of the things. God told Nathan to tell him it was because you despised the word of the Lord to do what was evil in his sight. David admitted, and we have it in Psalm 51.
Yes.
David admitted to his sin. And it was interesting, before he had gone through any of the things that the law said, I'm sure that he wants to carry through with the sacrifices that the law said, that the Lord has put away your sin, you won't die. Nevertheless, because this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that was born to you shall die. And David went to extraordinary measures on behalf of the child. He fasted, he prayed. He just stayed in that one room, and all of the elders were like, okay, now that the child has died, nobody wants to go tell the king that the child has died. And he hears him whispering, and he figures it out. The child's died. He gets up, everything cleans himself up, goes eats. And we see he's wise enough to know I can go to him, but he's not returning to me. But we see things kind of go downhill from here for David. The fallout from his sin is exile. shame. The people turn against him. His own son Absalom takes over the throne. Even some worthless guy has the audacity to throw rocks at him as he's leaving the country. David's reign is restored, but as God has promised, the sword is never going to leave him in peace after that. But his heart is still set on God, and we see that everything that he does, he still seeks the Lord, even though he does another thing by numbering the country, another sin that God punishes the people for and punishes David for. He understands, I've sinned, and he seeks the Lord in everything that he has done. So we get to,
There's an interesting thing there, Ron, and that number of the people. David prayed about that, asking the Lord, inquiring whether he should do it several times. And finally, it's like the Lord said, okay, you want to do it, you do it. There's a consequence.
yeah, and it depends on the translation you read on, and some translations, the way that it reads, it sounds like God incited him to number them. Others, that David was incited to number the people. Whatever the reason for doing what he did. Now you remember Moses, God told Israel through Moses, when you get to the land and you want to set up a king, this is how the king needs to act. And so they had their instructions already long ago on how they were supposed to act as a king. And you can see the violations in these golden years that they did, not paying attention to what God said. Even when we get to King Solomon, David had swore to Bathsheba that her son Solomon would reign after him. He got this from God, that Solomon was the one that God loved, and that Solomon was going to be the one that was going to sit on the throne. There's a whole bunch of intrigue and a whole bunch of people vying for the throne. Adonijah decides he's going to set this whole thing up, and he's the one that should be king according to him. But they hear about it, they do something about it right away. Solomon's sitting on the royal throne, and then Solomon cleans house. Joab, Adonijah, Shemaiah, all of the people that had given David grief, all ended up in the dirt. Solomon really cleaned house, and it says Solomon loved the Lord, and he walked in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. I looked at that, the wording of that. Before this happens, God appears to Solomon and says, ask me what you want. Solomon asks for wisdom. So God was pleased with that. Okay, I'm going to give you wisdom. I'm going to give you what you want. I'm also going to give you the things that you didn't ask for. Riches and honor. And I thought about this. What would happen if you asked God for understanding and he granted it, but he also gave you all of the numbers to the Powerball lottery, and it was in the billions? Was this a test to see where Solomon's heart really was? Was it a reward for just asking for wisdom? Solomon had instructions from Moses on how a king was supposed to act and what to do and what not to do. But he doesn't seem to have followed Moses and the Word of God. But he followed his own heart. We see that in Ecclesiastes. He chased after everything that he could chase after.
And he married a bunch of foreign women who helped lead him astray.
Very big key, very big key. And he doesn't talk like David. But notice the words of that. He walked in the statutes of David his father. He didn't, it doesn't say he walked in the statutes of the Lord. He did the things that David his father did. Was his faith his own? Or did he just do what his dad had told him to do? He tried to act what he saw his dad do, and he inherited his dad's faith, his family's faith. How often do we hear that? Somebody doesn't study their Bible, they just learn the stuff that their parents taught them, and that's how they think that God wants them to act, or my preacher said, or my grandmother said. You know, they walk in the ways of their parents or their grandparents or the preacher, but they don't have a faith of their own that comes from the Word. David was very humble. David praised God constantly. And as we see it, Solomon getting older, he doesn't do that. He builds a house that is really extraordinary, over the top. And I wondered why he did that. He had the instructions. God told Moses, build the thing according to the pattern that you saw on the mountain. God could have made a huge temple too, but he did this in a certain way. He wanted it done for a reason. Solomon went above and beyond almost everything that Moses said that a king shouldn't do, Solomon did. But Judah and Israel were as many as the sands of the sea. They ate and they drank and they were happy. Solomon ruled over all of the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the river Egypt, to the border Egypt. And Solomon had all this money coming in to him.
Well, there's your picture, Ron. Somewhat of an anti-type of Solomon being the wisest, ruling the kingdom as far as the Gaza all the way to the Euphrates. And also, what was the third one?
And I tried to think, the question that I asked in the beginning,
He built that house.
how does this have to do with God's redemptive plan? And my wife gave me the answer to that. She's reading right along in the same books that I'm reading, and she comes up with the answer. She's like, even this early, nobody came to visit when the ark was in a tent. The whole world came to Jerusalem to see this building. The Gentiles learned really early on that God was great. The Gentiles learned really early on that God had blessed this nation.
They wanted to hear
Whatever
Solomon
reason.
also. They
Not
also-
because they were great people, but because he was a great God. So that Gentiles are already getting in the very start of this nation. Gentiles are getting an introduction into who God is. They didn't come to visit when he was in a tent. So maybe this is why God did this. This doesn't span but 80 years, these golden years.
This
But
may be
there's a
like
thing
God
there, too.
introducing the Gentiles into the Jewish religion.
The thing you get into too, when you look at this, Solomon's kingdom was, God had blessed him, everything he did as a thought of man would do. If I marry these wives and make these good, I'll have peace. If I do this, and he ended up prospering through that way, just as we see people often do today. And yet, God does use it to give people insight into him. But all those people around him also were looking at paying tribute. If you think about it, afterwards, they were looking to see Israel fall.
Yeah.
They wanted to see Israel fall. They were so jealous of what Israel had. And Solomon, in thinking like a man and doing things like a man, actually set up Israel for the fall.
Well, he didn't ask, he asked for wisdom to rule his people, to guide his people.
To guide his people, and God gave that. He also told him, and I highlighted this when he talked to him the second time. He made promises to Solomon. If you will walk before me as David your father walked, in the integrity of your heart, the uprightness, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. God told David, your son will build my house, and my house will stand forever, and his kingdom will stand forever. No if, no then, no conditions. God said this was going to happen. Now we get to Solomon, all of a sudden there's a conditional promise. And then also, with that conditional promise came, if you don't do this, oh yeah, there, the second one. If you turn aside from following me, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and this house will become a heap of ruins. So the unconditional promise that he gave to David has been initially fulfilled. Solomon has built the house, but now this is conditional. But the promise that he made to David is still unconditional. So that's how we know, and we learn through later on that this promise is yet to be fulfilled, that there was a Messiah coming. There was somebody from David's lineage that was going to build a house that would be forever. They kept thinking physical. God is taking them, taking humanity from thinking physical, trying to taking us all along to try to think spiritual.
But he's trying to show us in the physical part, the spiritual. When you look at Solomon, he had all that wisdom. He had the kingdom. And he built the house. There's a picture again of Christ. That's the physical that God is showing. But also, he would show that spirit. He wants us to see that spiritual. There's that other picture he's giving us in that time frame. They're not going to see it. They came to see Solomon also because of his wisdom. It's looking at a picture of Christ and his wisdom. All the people who come to Zion. And his law will go throughout. You look at Solomon. You study that real good. You'll see a picture of Christ. Most people don't see that.
And this is also his fulfillment of his promise to Abraham. Not only is he going to make them a great nation, he's going to make them among all of the nations. Nobody's ever been wealthier than them. Nobody's ever had all of the stuff that Israel had in one little tiny place ever again. I mean, when you start reading what a talent is, 75 pounds, and he had 666 talents of gold coming to him every month. And it was just, the amount of gold. But what was Solomon's turning point?
If you go back, there's a point that he made, if you go back on his slides, that promise he made, to walk in uprightness with the integrity of your heart, that he made, he's even telling Solomon, David was spiritual. David followed me not only physically, but spiritually. And what you're gonna need to do is follow with both spiritual as well as physical.
But also as rich as Solomon was physically, look at Christ, spiritually, his riches. There it is.
Yeah. You
And
see
that's a
that,
contrast.
you see both of them, and wisdom wise, all wisdom. So, what's Solomon's turning point? Because all of a sudden, again, the Lord is angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, who had appeared to him twice. And then, because of this practice, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, I'm going to tear the kingdom from you. However, because of the promise that I made to David, that unconditional promise that I made to David, I'm not going to tear everything away from you, but left him with one. So, I believe it was like Beverly said, foreign wives that God had told him, don't intermarry with these people. That was one. Solomon loved women, and that was a downfall. 700 wives, 300 concubines. One is way too much for me to handle, let alone 1,000. I love her like 1,000, but there's no way he could take care of that the way he should. Materialism, seeing the physical and not the spiritual, maybe that was. I got a feeling that his downfall, King was supposed to have a copy of this next to the throne, and he was supposed to read it every single day. And I have a feeling that not reading the book is what turned him, got his mind on other things and turned him down a bad road.
Ron,
Don't you think David always remembered being the young person that went up against Goliath, and God gave him the ability to smite Goliath?
It seems like
Solomon had.
David had his own arrogant times, but David, and he was a tough dude, killing bears and lions with his bare hands and stuff like that, going after him when they went after a sheep. I'm like, I'll shoot one from 300 yards away, but I'm not taking after one by that.
I think
And he never lost that humility, that never forgot where he was from.
Well, that's
Solomon's empire stretched from the river all the way to the Euphrates at the height of the golden years, and in a few short weeks and months, it got reduced to this. Because he didn't do what God told him to do. And he did what God told him not to do. He had the instructions right there. Forgot the instructions. It can happen. And I think that's why God has shown us that this is part of his plan. From big to little in no time at all. Only 80 years, just a moment in history, never to be repeated again. Never has any nation prospered like that nation had. We don't have it. We're in debt that much money, but we don't have that much money in the United States. So God was showing us that even as good as you can make yourself, you still need redeeming. You still are going to sin. You still need my help, because I can take you from this to this in just a very short time.
Amen.
Thank you.
That was you.
I put some of those things on the file, I did this slide.
Good job, brother.